Welcome to the next part of the presentation on the 5 tenets of 21st century flood risk wisdom for everyone interested in property. This video addresses the fourth modern tenet, that due diligence is pricing risk. You've probably heard the phrase due diligence because it is an important legal term for the responsibility of parties involved in a property transaction to carefully investigate all material risks. Property buyers and renters, and of course builders, have a clear responsibility for flood risk due diligence. But in our modern world, so too do brokers, managers, consultants, investors, and lenders. These third parties working on behalf of buyers, renters, and builders need to show that they have been wise about their clients' flood risk. They can't afford to be a fool. There's also a very important corollary responsibility. Government officials with a public trust regarding flood risk have a fiduciary duty to encourage transaction due diligence and to do what they can to improve the standard of practice. None of us would be shocked to learn that nearly all property transactions hinge on price. So we shouldn't be shocked to hear that a lot of due diligence requires pricing of risks. It's worth noting that pricing wind and fire risk has been the due diligence standard of practice for nearly a century, and pricing environmental risks has been the standard of practice for over 3 decades. Routine pricing methods for these risks are used in virtually all property valuations and transactions. As might be expected, investment and commercial banks involved in big property transactions drove the standard of practice for wind, fire, and environmental risk pricing. Today, a lot of wind, fire, and environmental risk pricing is so routine that it is deferred to insurance companies through policy quotes tied to appropriate actuarial costs. And governments facilitate this due diligence standard of practice by providing information about both the natural hazard and the building conditions that allow the risk to be effectively priced. The rationale behind pricing the fire, wind, and environmental risk specific to a property as part of due diligence logically says we should also price the location-specific flood risk for that property. In the previous 3 videos, we've just walked through the location-specific nature of flood exposure, the flood hazard curve, and estimating flood risk expected annual cost and present value. Given its standardized use with other risks, we shouldn't be surprised to find that the idea of pricing flood risk has actually been around for decades. Here are some flood hazard curves and a manual for optimizing flood risk mitigation using detailed flood risk pricing that are over 40 years old. But while it has been around, until recently, pricing flood risk has not been the due diligence standard of practice. The reason is that in the past, major cost and technical challenges limited the development of flood hazard curves to just special locations. In 1968, these obstacles led Congress to essentially create a stopgap binary approach to flood hazard as part of a national flood insurance program, with the binary flood hazard depicted on what are called flood insurance rate maps. With few exceptions, using the NFIP firms to gauge flood risk, despite being obviously too simplistic, became the due diligence standard of practice. And it remained the standard of practice for 50 years. But, as they say, the game is changing. Technology has recently overcome the old obstacles and is now enabling flood risk pricing for every property. We'll have more to say on problems with the NFIP approach and the recent advances in our later discussion on technology. With technology advances, the due diligence standard of practice is now in the process of becoming what it should be, flood risk pricing. This can be seen in the increasing number of specialty consultants that are supporting larger businesses facing complex flood financial risk decisions, and in the growth of private flood insurance. At the same time that the capability for providing flood risk pricing is increasing, there is escalating concern over climate change. And climate change is driving more rigorous flood risk pricing as the due diligence standard of practice. The demand for the most rigorous flood risk pricing is among the major buyers, financiers, and securitizers of debt involving business property. Wall Street always wants real numbers on the future repayment risk for corporate and commercial loans, but more and more also on municipal bonds backed by presumptions of healthy local economies. So Wall Street increasingly wants to know what the present value of flood risk looks like. In demanding flood risk pricing as part of the due diligence standard of practice, Wall Street is raising the bar for every loan originator in every part of the country. So, in sum, every household, business, organization, and government facility, together with brokers, managers, investors, and lenders, is obliged to exercise due diligence regarding the location-specific flood risk for property transactions. Furthermore, not only are the previous tenets supporting flood risk pricing wise, they are also becoming the standard of practice for property transaction due diligence. In the next video, we'll discuss the fifth and last tenet of 21st century flood risk wisdom. It follows from the first four, and it is resilience is good insurance plus sensible mitigation. Again, please don't hesitate to email, text, or call me with comments and questions.